So here we are, the last lecture of the semester. It always feels good to close something out. I still get that feeling when I finish a book. Even at a PhD level, it's still very gratifying, very satisfying. Anyway, it's the last lecture of the semester, and even though there are historians, some of whom happen to be on this campus, that feel that what I'm about to talk about is just not history, it's more or less current events. I really, really enjoy this lecture, and I very much think that it's important when it comes to understanding the big picture, which is why I've entitled it Back to the Future. Okay? If you're a film buff, you might know of that movie. It's one of my favorite movies of all time. It's just a fun little movie, but in any case, Christopher Lloyd and Michael J. Fox in those movies. It was a franchise ultimately. One of the reasons I like this probably is because I happen to be a historian, and you can see that the events of the past directly influence how we live in the future, and they actually give implications for the future. Okay, and so in any case, what I need you to understand before we go any further is the events that we've been talking about, probably specifically to what I'm about to say, have been brewing since the late 70s, the 1980s, the 1990s, and the chickens, if you will, have come home to roost. Whether those are good things or bad things, we're seeing that the future really has been influenced by the past. Okay. Let's begin by where we left off the last time, which was the War on Terror. We know that one of the things that came about from those September 11th, 2001 attacks was the first war of the 21st century. And Bush had declared war on terror, but as we found out the last time I had you, there is no country called the Republic of Terror, right? It does not exist. There are, however, countries that harbor terror and terrorism, and one of the countries that we found out pretty quickly after the attacks was Afghanistan. Okay, Afghanistan was ran by an extremist regime, a radical Islamic regime known as the Taliban. Okay, and when George W. Bush demanded that the Taliban turn over Osama bin Laden to the United States, they said, "We've got him, but we want to negotiate." And he said, "No, we do not negotiate. You're either with us or against us." And the Taliban refused, and so we started bombing Afghanistan. Now, this bombing campaign and the ground war that would later follow was highly successful because we toppled the Taliban very, very quickly. The challenge in the aftermath of getting rid of the extremists was not defeating the bad guys. That had already happened. It was about rebuilding Afghanistan in a way that was sustainable, meaning putting in place a regime that, number one, was good to the Afghan people, and number two, was not going to do things like harbor, terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda, okay? So what we want to do is really rebuild Afghanistan in a democratic fashion, small d democratic fashion. The problem with this, and this is something that you probably should have your eye on right now, this is not the first time that the United States has tried to do this. I mean, this is exactly what we wanted to do in Vietnam generally, and South Vietnam in particular. The problem then and now is you're talking about a culture that is very, very different from our own. This is a culture that doesn't necessarily understand exactly what we mean by democracy. It's more or less a tribal culture. And so we're talking apples and they're talking oranges. And as you might imagine, this is really going to be a complicated matter, and it's not going to be as easy as it sounds to place democracy within the Middle East, whether you're talking about Afghanistan or elsewhere, okay? Now, the war on terror had domestic influences as well. There are things that come about due to the war on terror that are felt here at home. And one of the more prominent things that I need you to know about would be the USA Patriot Act, okay? Now, in the aftermath of the attacks, you need to keep in mind that we felt vulnerable. I mean, this is the worst attack on American soil. This is New York and Washington that had ever really been witnessed. I mean, of course, there was Pearl Harbor, but number one, there was an ocean between the mainland and where the attacks took place. We're talking about New York City, Washington, D.C. And so we're very nervous about an impending, additional attack. What is important here is that there's a lot of Americans that feel as though we needed to give this federal government more power to watch over and make sure that the bad guys aren't going to get us again. And so the Patriot Act is largely coming out of this context, okay? What the Patriot Act, in fact, does is gives the federal government a lot more power to monitor the behavior of potential enemies that are living and operating within the United States. This, as we now know, could be thought of as listening in on private phone conversations, Google searches, what you're checking out on the internet, the library books that you're checking out. It's very broadly defined, and before I go any further, it's not just the bad guys that we ultimately found out that the US government was snooping on. Okay, there's a lot of people that had absolutely nothing to do with international terrorism or domestic terrorism for that matter that ultimately saw their privacy breached. Okay, anyway, what the Patriot Act does is it directly corresponds, and I hope that I see this in some of your final exams, it directly corresponds with this expansion of government and reduction of freedom. Okay, there are things that the government could not do, legally anyway, before September 11th that it can do after September 11th, which directly relates to how free are we? That question that I asked you in the first day class. Okay. Now, who we were after in Afghanistan was Osama bin Laden. He was directly responsible for the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And the FBI had a reward on his head. In 2003, we, as a society, decide that we're going to expand this war on terror. In his 2003 State of the Union address, George W. Bush said that there was this axis of evil, and this axis consisted of Iran, Iraq, and North Korea, right? And those three countries were these rogue regimes that could not be trusted, and more importantly, especially in the case of Iraq, led by that madman Saddam Hussein, they were all actively trying to develop weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons and beyond all of those things. And so it's out of this context that we develop something called the Bush Doctrine. Now, this is very important. What the Bush Doctrine says is that the United States should have the ability to attack other countries even if they have not yet attacked us. In other words, yeah, Saddam and Iraq has not done anything to us yet, but we know that they're developing weapons of mass destruction. We know that Saddam is an evil, brutal dictator who would not think a second of using weapons of mass destruction, and we also know he doesn't like us very much. So what the Bush Doctrine is seeking to do is sort of implement what I think of as preemptive attacks, right? Get the bad guys, get the Hitlers of the world before the Hitlers of the world are so powerful that, they're a really, really big problem and millions of people have to die because of this, okay? So it's a preemptive, preventative attack before that other country has hit us yet, okay? So in March 2003, we declare war on Iraq because Saddam Hussein is not being cooperative enough for allowing UN weapons inspectors in to make sure that he does not have weapons of mass destruction. And so we launch yet another war that can broadly be defined as part of this war on terrorism. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but without going too far into it, you get the gist, right? The problem is not defeating Saddam and defeating Iraq. That wasn't the problem the first go around in 1990, 1991, and it's not going to be, a decade later, right? We topple the Saddam regime very quickly. We send him into exile. Later on, he'll be found. The problem is, once we toppled the Hussein regime, we wanted to set up a stable government. Now, Dick Cheney, the vice president, that was a really big player in this invasion, Dick Cheney mentioned that we would be greeted as liberators. And at first they were very, very happy, the Iraqis that is, that we had gotten rid of Saddam, and he was a bad guy. I'm not saying that, but what I am saying is they said get out. Basically, the second that Saddam was gone, they said, okay, you can leave now. And we said, we can't leave now because we've got to set up a stable government. We got to make sure that you're okay. And generally speaking, what you're seeing here is the rise of an insurgency. You know, terrorists and other like-minded people that want to expel non-Muslims from the Muslim world. And here we have what is largely seen as an occupation of a Muslim country. And so you see this insurgency here that's not really like a Civil War, World War II style, you know, casualty figures or whatever it is that you want to call it, but it's a slow but steady trickle of blood back to Washington that's a constant reminder that we've got ourselves into something that we can't really get out of in Iraq, okay? This is not good for Bush. Anytime that casualty figures mount, it's bad for your approval ratings, and this is no this is no exception. 2004 is going to be an election year. Bush is up for re-election, and the guy that he's going to run against as the Democrat is a guy that you should have heard of. He's still very active in American politics, a guy by the name of John Kerry, okay? At the time, Kerry was a senator from the state of Massachusetts, and he was really a foreign policy expert. He had served in the Senate for a number of years, and he had served in a lot of foreign policy committees. He was a Vietnam veteran himself, so he was a war hero, was a decorated veteran at that. And so if this is in fact a war that's a referendum on our foreign policy, this is a really formidable, very challenging opponent, right? George Bush can't really run on Iraq because Iraq ain't going so well for us in 2004. Okay, so what you do when you can't run on your policies is you change the conversation. And his campaign strategist, Karl Rove, generally changes the conversation. He changes it in two ways. One, he begins to question Kerry's record. What you see is a collection of attack ads that are entitled the Swift Boat Veterans for Truth ads. And these Swift Boat veterans, these are Vietnam veterans like Kerry, that really begin to call into question exactly what it was that John Kerry did over there. He lied about what he did over there, for instance. He exaggerated the truth. And most importantly, once he came back, he said, I don't support the war. A lot of these people appearing in these ads said that that dishonored his country, dishonored the military, right? So it really raised a lot of doubts as to how much we could trust John Kerry, right? The other thing that the Republicans were able to do is to really rally their base when it comes to these social issues. All across the country, but especially in swing states like Ohio, there were measures on the ballot involving same-sex marriage, stem cell research, and gun control measures. Now, obviously, that's really going to resonate with social conservatives, and it really inspired those people to come down to the polls to make sure that those things were defeated, those initiatives were defeated. And while they were there, they said, I might as well take the time to vote for the conservative candidate, which happened to be George Bush. And so a lot of political scientists believe that that was really important to get swing states like Ohio and Florida to go over to the Republicans once again. And Bush is going to win this election. He's going to survive re-election. This time, he's going to win a majority of the popular vote, which was not something that he could point to in the first go-around with his election. Okay, Bush wins, but if you remember correctly, there's some trouble on the horizon. Those casualties aren't declining in Iraq, and that's never good for your approval ratings. The insurgency is very much alive and well from 2005, 2006, and on, right? Furthermore, there was scandals involving port sales in places like New York and San Francisco, the areas in which goods and people are brought into this country from abroad. The Bush administration was pushing the sale of some of these port spaces to Dubai, a country that we knew had at least some loose affiliation with known terrorists, right? Here's the guy that campaigned on this idea that you can't trust John Kerry because he's so wishy-washy, he could be soft on our enemies. Here's the same guy trying to push this idea that we need to give space to people that we don't necessarily trust, right? But what really hurts George Bush is his attempt to privatize Social Security. Now, I'm really hopeful that you can remember back when we were talking about the Social Security Act in 1935. If there's ever, a way that you really want to see your approval rating deteriorate, really make grandma and grandpa mad, right? That'll do the trick every single time. If you can make the AARP mad, it'll work 100% of the time, right? Your approval ratings, your election campaigns, all of this will go south in a hurry, right? Elderly people had been paying into Social Security really their entire lives. I mean, ever since 1935. And the idea of handing over the money that we're taking in from Social Security to Wall Street and having Wall Street potentially gamble that money away and lose it, that was the risk involved with privatization of Social Security. It really raised a lot of eyebrows in the elderly voter communities, and a lot of these people take out their frustrations in the 2006 election when the Democrats not only took back the House of Representatives, 2006, they also take back the Senate. We're not talking about states like liberal Massachusetts or left-wing California. We're talking about states like Montana, states like Virginia, states like North Carolina, which were deeply red states, okay? This is not good for Bush. Unfortunately, it's going to get much worse. In September 2005, you have a Category 5 hurricane, Hurricane Katrina, that's going to hit the port city of New Orleans. Now, if you know anything about New Orleans, it's a city that's unique in the sense that it's below sea level. And so if you're going to have a city like this, it's a major city, then you better have a really, really, really good system to keep the water out, a dam system. Now, New Orleans is not the only city that's in this predicament. You've got other cities throughout the world like Amsterdam, Sydney, Australia, that are coastal cities that really need to think about the same questions. And the people of New Orleans leading up to 2005 would often say it was actually embarrassing to go to these other conferences throughout the world and explain what we had when these other cities like Amsterdam in particular had state-of-the-art cutting-edge technology that would literally move walls, if need be, to prevent a catastrophe from happening. Well, when Katrina hit, the levees that were designed and maintained by the Army Corps of Engineers, i.e. the federal government, were woefully inadequate. And it wasn't the storm itself, it wasn't the rain or the wind that really did in the city. It was the breaking of those levees that flooded the city, trapped people in their houses. A lot of people are retreating all the way up to their attics. And it's New Orleans in the middle of September. You're talking about triple-digit heat, lots of humidity. People are dying from a lot of these things. If you remember, a lot of people took refuge in the home of the New Orleans Saints, the Superdome. And you're packing all these people for days at a time on top of each other, and you're doing everything that people do every single day, brushing your teeth and otherwise. Clearly health hazards, right? People don't have water to drink. People don't have food to eat. And the federal response is painfully, painfully slow. Now, to their credit, the federal government did issue a warning days before the hurricane hit. You need to leave. You need to vacate the city. But it's my opinion, and this is just an opinion, that's all it is the next closest thing to impossible to completely evacuate a major American city. There are people that just don't have the means to do that. And so you better have a mechanism in place to respond once that natural disaster hits. The government agency that's in place to deal with things like this is the Federal Emergency Relief Agency, FEMA, right? Now, FEMA is designed to deal with these disasters, and it's one of the organizations that is moving at a glacier pace, painfully too slow to respond to the crisis. We are now at crisis levels in the days after Katrina, right? The guy that is the head of FEMA is a guy by the name of Michael Brown. And Michael Brown's really, shall we say, inexperienced when it comes to heading up organizations like this. And he's going to take a lot of criticism from public opinion in the sense that the federal response is woefully inadequate. Now, several days, more like weeks, pass before George Bush comes down to New Orleans and Mississippi and tours and surveys the damage. But when he does this, one of the things that he says on national television is that, Michael Brown, you're doing one great job. You're doing a bang-up job. And clearly he's not. Clearly the response is inadequate. And this is when public opinion really begins to turn on the Bush administration. Okay, it's really not doing the Republicans any favors, even though Bush doesn't have to run for re-election in 2008. Okay, it seems as if the wheels are falling off the car, but it actually gets worse. In the fall of 2008, the housing market bubble, which had really been driving the American economy up to this point, it burst, right? Much like the 1990s tech stock bubble in the early 2000s, it came to a screeching halt. The driver of the economy, home loans and refinance homes and insurance policies and all the things that go into making a home, they all came to a screeching halt. And when it did that, the entire economy crashed along with it. I mean, the Dow Jones is doing some crazy things. Some of the craziest things that we've seen since the great crash of '29. Now, about these firms, these Wall Street firms, we're not talking about mom and pop shops that are having to close their doors, or even modestly large companies. These are Goliath corporations. Investment banks are going belly up. Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, federal lending institutions like Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, home loaning institutions like those that I just mentioned, they're on the brink of failure. I mean, we're talking about a cataclysmic collapse of the American economy, which would probably have been greater than what we saw in 1929. And the question is, who's next? Bank of America, Citigroup, Morgan Stanley, because they're all interconnected. As a matter of fact, what the American people were told was, these institutions are too big to fail. We need to have a bailout, which is what is proposed by the Bush administration in 2008, a bailout. Really, it's proposed by everybody, not just the Bush administration, but politicians generally speaking. Now, when we got a good close look, we being the American people, when we got a good close look of exactly what this bailout was going to consist of, the American people said, no, let Wall Street fail, right? Let it deal with the own mess that it created. We're tired of bailing them out. And so the first go around, it does ultimately fail. We do put together a package that ultimately does pass the second time around, but this creates an awful lot of resentment amongst the American people. The other thing that it does is it almost kills the Republican chance of retaining the White House, let alone anything more, in the election of 2008, right? It almost makes it a slam dunk, can't miss for the Democrats that year. Who we thought was going to be president in 2008, when all of this starts to get going, was Hillary Clinton. After all, she was a household name. Her husband had been president before George Bush. And so this was seen as almost like a lock, and nobody had ever heard of Barack Obama. But what really changed the game, in addition to the crashing of the economy, was the fact that Obama had middle-class roots. Much like Bill Clinton, he wasn't one of these political legacies. He wasn't a very wealthy American by the time that he launched a political career. But more than anything else, Barack Obama had voted against going to war in Iraq when he was a congressman from Illinois. Hillary Clinton, as a senator from New York, had actually voted to take the country in war, which was a terribly unpopular decision by 2008, and a decision that Hillary Clinton never ultimately really apologized to the American people for, never really explained, really. Okay? So it was Barack Obama as the anti-war candidate that's going to ultimately really deliver him as the Democratic candidate in 2008, okay? Now, the Republican candidate is going to be a guy from Arizona by the name of John McCain. McCain presents himself as a Washington outsider. He calls himself a maverick, a guy that can think for himself, and is not just going to walk in lockstep with the Bush administration or the mainstream of the Republican Party. The problem is the Republicans are damaged goods by 2008. George Bush was a pretty unpopular president. A lot of these policies were seen as Republican policies, whether you're talking about foreign policies or what's going on with Wall Street. And there's some ownership, rightly or wrongly. When the economy is in the toilet, we tend to blame the party that's in power, which happens to be the Republicans right now, as opposed to the actual contributors to the disasters. Okay? Now, McCain needs a game changer, so to speak, and that game changer is going to come to us via Alaska and Sarah Palin. Palin was the Republican governor of Alaska that John McCain is going to tap as his running mate in 2008. Now, there's a lot to like about Palin. She's very young, very energetic. There's also a lot to be concerned with, and the things to be concerned with is she doesn't have a lot of experience, especially when it comes to foreign policy. Now, McCain's an older gentleman, right? Even back in 2008, he's an older gentleman. And so the idea here is the vice president is literally a heartbeat away from the presidency, and you have this candidate here that doesn't have a lot of experience, and every time the press talked to her, it became increasingly clear that she didn't have a lot of experience. And the long story short was Palin does not do McCain an awful lot of favors. I mean, it was already going to be a pretty long shot for him to win the presidency, and ultimately it really, in my opinion, again, this is an opinion, hurts him more than it helps him with the selection of Sarah Palin. So if you're looking at that 2008 election map in the PowerPoint, it's a pretty blue map. And it's blue in places that have traditionally been red, places like Nevada, Indiana, for goodness sakes, North Carolina, Florida goes blue in this election, okay? Before we go ahead and say that there's a political transition similar to 1932 or 1980 with Ronald Reagan, I want you to look at the next map. In the 2010 midterm elections, the congressional elections, the Republicans have a resurgence, right? There's a lot of Republicans 2 years after Barack Obama is elected president that are being elected governor, that are being elected senator, congressman. A lot of state races go clearly over to the Republican side of things. And it's not just the Republicans that are winning here, right? In 2010, in the aftermath of this Wall Street meltdown, when people had lost their houses, people had lost their jobs, there were these rallies that were called Tea Party rallies, taxed enough already, right? They were anti-government in the sense that they didn't like Washington's bailout of the big banks and the corporations. But the other sense was that Washington just spends too much money. Washington lives beyond its means. It harkened back to the Reagan era of government. It's not the solution to a problem, it's government that is the problem. And initially it begins as this grassroots social movement, the idea that we want government to live within its means and stop taxing the American people, stop asking the American people to really work for the special interests. The dilemma comes a few years after 2008 when you see what a lot of historians will call the special interests taking over this Tea Party movement, all right? You begin to see millions and later billions of dollars funneled into the Tea Party from corporate America, selecting candidates or backing candidates, people like Sarah Palin, later on people like Ted Cruz, that are calling themselves Tea Party Republicans. And so this Tea Party is really growing out of the disaster of 2008 and really, really coming into its own in 2010. And what this Tea Party transition of the Republican Party, probably a better way of looking at it is a Republican transition of the Tea Party. It's the Republicans doing what the Democrats did back in the Gilded Age of gobbling up and absorbing the Populist Party, is it's really pushing the Republican Party to the distant right, right? You're seeing not only Republicans winning elections in battleground states, you're seeing very conservative Tea Party Republicans running against other Republicans in primary races and defeating those mainstream, or what they're called in some instances they're called moderate Republicans. If you happen to be a staunch conservative, the term rhino may apply, Republican in name only. Those are people that are going away, and the Republicans Party are becoming a much more conservative, even by George Bush standards, a much more conservative organization. And in my opinion, the results of all of this has still yet to be felt. On the flip side of the coin, you see a liberal social movement that's really coming into its own as well. It's a movement that I bet some of you have heard of called the Occupy movement, right? This idea of occupying Wall Street. Well, why Wall Street? After 2010, the Supreme Court ruled on this decision entitled the Citizens United versus the United States. And what Citizens United said was corporations are people, and spending money on political campaigns is free speech. Corporations are people, money is free speech. And there's a lot of people that said, what? McDonald's can't be a corporation. McDonald's can't be a person, it's a corporation, it's a business entity. And furthermore, spending money is not free speech, right? In any case, what this does, what Citizens United does, is allows corporations, McDonald's, Walmart, and otherwise, to dump millions and millions of dollars. It really takes the limits off of how much you can spend on political campaigns, how many political campaigns that you can sponsor, and it really integrates an awful lot of corporate money, unimaginable amounts of corporate money, into American politics. And as far as a lot of people on the left, and really on the right too, were concerned, this is poisoning the well that is democracy. This is a big challenge. So what a lot of people began to say is, we need to protest not in Washington. That's where decisions are made. That's sort of like treating the symptoms and not treating the actual illness itself, right? We need to take our protest to Wall Street, take it down to the big banks, let them know that we don't appreciate them trying to buy our democracy. And so what the Occupy movement does, and it expands beyond Wall Street, beyond New York, beyond really every country, every city, major city in America, it's about staging these sit-in demonstrations in places like Wall Street, letting it be known that we don't appreciate the government working for the richest Americans in the country, simply because they can afford to influence public policy much greater than virtually anybody else can. We want money out of politics. And you see not only a lot of these protests really gaining a lot of attention nationally, you see a pretty significant police backlash against them. Tear gas, mace, other sort of unsavory looking tactics that are used to beat back this movement are being unleashed against the protesters, and actually it's doing the protesters a lot more favors than it is the police, in the sense that this is headline news, okay? So what does it all mean, right? The so what factor of not only this lecture but this class. I'd like you to understand, and I hope that you can see, that there are things that have happened 30, 40, 50, 100 years ago that are making their presence felt in our day and age, right? Are we in a political crisis? I don't know. Historians are really good Monday morning quarterbacks, not so great fortune tellers, so I don't know. I'd like to think that this is no different than, what people like Martin Luther King must have thought, in the 1950s when it seemed like the world was against him, okay? So have some perspective when you think about where we are today, the potential problems, the problems that we have. And what I need you to think about is, are we freer? Again, that's really been the million-dollar question for this class. It's certainly going to be important for your final exam. Are we freer? We've done a lot to try to address this. We've passed a lot of policies. We've made a lot of things that were once upon a time squeaky clean legal, illegal. Do we have anything to show for that, right? Let me leave you with a quote, because I think that you can get a lot of punch out of a quote. There was one of the more famous American authors in literary history, a guy by the name of George Orwell. He wrote books that I bet you're familiar with, 1984, for example, Animal Farm. Orwell said, once upon a time, he who controls the pasts ultimately controls the future. So what we're seeing here in the 21st century is the fight for history. What does it all mean? You know, I don't just mean like years from now. What I mean is the actual narrative, the things that were considered historical facts and historical truths even 20 years ago. You're seeing this in places like Texas, where textbooks are produced. And you're seeing this with science classes that want to teach intelligent design right next to, the Big Bang Theory, for example. You're seeing this, with how our country was founded in the first place, that the founding fathers were really, fundamentalist Christians, and they had premised the idea of America on this idea of Judeo-Christian thought, right? You see this with respect to, concepts of free speech, and as I mentioned with the Citizens United decision, what constitutes free speech, what constitutes, rights in America. Should corporations like Hobby Lobby should have the same rights as Joe Sixpack that's walking down the street? The average American has religious rights. You can pray in public. You can have religious convictions, and the government is not supposed to infringe upon those religious convictions. For example, in places throughout the Southwest, there are Native Americans that claim part of their religion is to take mind-altering drugs, peyote and other things. It was part of their spiritual convictions, and therefore passing a law that makes the peyote and other things of that sort illegal is essentially an infringement upon religious rights. There are a lot of questions when it comes to opening this up through the Citizens United decision that are ultimately going to go on unanswered. And so you're really seeing a critical time in our nation's history. And I don't just mean because we've got a lot of really important political questions to answer and to account for, but, where we've come from and what it all means. The last 100 years of historical narrative is really, in ways, being rewritten. I guess that's me being polite about this. And in other ways, and both sides are guilty of this, I don't want to choose winners and losers here, you're seeing efforts to control that history, right? So in any case, I really, really hope that this class has been useful for you, and I don't just mean that you've successfully completed it and now you're going to go on to the next level and get a piece of paper that makes you earn $1 million a year. I really hope that you have seen connections to how you live your life today. I hope that you feel that you're a more enlightened and educated citizen. I hope this helps you make some sense in terms of how and why the United States is the way that it is. We have the policies that we have, and we do some of the things that we do today. In essence, that really has been the essence of why we study history. I also want to thank you. It really has been a pleasure working with you and working for you this past semester. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to let me know. And don't be strangers. One of the things that I very much enjoy about the kind of work that I do is people that knock on my door that had me 3, 4, 8 years ago and come back and they tell me where they are now. And, not to just flatter my ego or anything like that, but to tell me what a difference that the class made in their life, right? For whatever reason. Anyway, best of luck in your final exams, not just in my class, but beyond. Best of luck in your future academic endeavors, and best of luck generally speaking. It really has been a pleasure. I'll talk to you later.